details when they're up with other colleagues who weren't able to attend. Before we get to our keynote speaker today, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Carol Johnson. Carol's Emerita Professor of Politics and International Relations at the University of Adelaide. Her main research interests are in Australian and comparative politics, the politics of gender and sexuality, the politics of emotion, and analysis of ideology and discourse. She is a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. She was elected in 2005 and has served on several of the Academy's committee, as well as a member of our Executive Committee from 2012 to 2014. She's also a former president of the Australian Political Studies Association and is one of 12 other Australian political scientists who have been awarded the APSA Lifetime Achievement Award. Carol is going to introduce Professor Walter. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. As both a Fellow of the Academy and a member of the Fay Gale Centre for Research on Gender at the University of Adelaide, I'm delighted to be involved in welcoming you to this lecture and would like to add to the earlier acknowledgement of country by specifically acknowledging that the Kaurna people are the custodians of the land on which the University of Adelaide is built. In terms of the Academy, which is hosting this lecture today, I should perhaps mention that the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia brings together over 700 of Australia's leading researchers and professionals across the social science disciplines. As an independent, not-for-profit organisation, the Academy draws on the expertise of its fellowship to provide practical, evidence-based advice to governments and industry on important social policy issues. It also actively promotes understanding of the social sciences and champions excellence across its many fields of learning. The Fay Gale Lecture in particular honours the late Professor Gwendolyn Fay Gale AO, 1932 to 2008, the Academy's first female president from 1997 to 2000. Professor Gale was the first honours graduate in geography at the University of Adelaide and went on to become an eminent human geographer. She was well known for her contributions to academia, the advancement of women within academia, Indigenous studies and juvenile justice. She was elected as a Fellow of the Academy in 1978. In 1989, she received the Order of Australia for her contributions to the social sciences, most notably in the fields of geography and Indigenous studies. She served as Vice-Chancellor of the University of Western Australia from 1990 to 1997. Fay's many publications still make important contributions today. They include not only her path-breaking work on Indigenous juvenile justice, or too often injustice issues, but also key books, especially the edited collection, Woman's Role in Aboriginal Society, and We Are Bosses Ourselves, The Status and Role of Aboriginal Women Today. Like others who knew her, I have no doubt Fay would have been fascinated by today's lecture and would have fully appreciated the importance of Indigenous data sovereignty, both for traditional cultural knowledge reasons and because we live in an increasingly data-driven society and economy. The Fay Gale Centre for Research on Gender, which commemorates Fay and is co-hosting today's lecture along with the Academy, was launched in December 2009. It aims to enhance the quality and impact of interdisciplinary research on gender issues in both national and transnational contexts. Major research themes, which are highly relevant to today's lecture, include issues of social inclusion and citizenship. Another important way in which the memory of Fay Gale is commemorated is, of course, this lecture, in which the Academy each year invites a distinguished female social scientist to present the Fay Gale Lecture at 2 universities. And I will now pass over to Chris to introduce a very distinguished female social scientist indeed, Professor Maggie Walter. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you very much for that background. Our typical mode for this Fay Gale Lecture, as Carol said, is that it's presented at 2 different universities. Given the year we've had and the context, this lecture is being presented at lots of universities simultaneously. So we're very pleased that everyone's been able to join, and as I said, this will be recorded. So it's now my absolute pleasure to introduce our lecturer for the 2020 Fay Gale Lecture, Professor Maggie Walter. Maggie, as many of you will know, is a Palawa woman from northern Tasmania. She's a founding member of the Maiam, Nayri, Wingara Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective and the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. She's Distinguished Professor of Sociology and was inaugural Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Aboriginal Research and Leadership at the University of Tasmania up until earlier this year. And she's also a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. Her research focuses on race relations, inequality, research methods and methodologies. And she's passionate about improving the position of Aboriginal people in Australian society and changing the dynamics around race relations. She has edited and co-authored a number of publications, including the best-selling Social Research Methods, and was co-author of Inequality in Australia, Discourses, Realities and Directions, and Indigenous Statistics, a Quantitative Methodology. So with that, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Maggie Walter.
Palinga, thank you, Chris, and thank you, everybody. I'm just going to share the screen and get us going. Palinga, everybody. Mina Maggie Walter, Mina Palawa Lutruwita, Wizzy Waranta, Kani Mapli Milathina, Mina Tunapri Palawa Nigimpi Nagumpi Takara, Mukaminya Milathina Nika. So, properly, my name is Maggie Walter. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Aboriginal lands, and I pay my respects to the Palawa people, the traditional owners of the country on which I'm standing. This wonderful beach you can see in the background here is up at Little Nussero Point, which is the country where I am from. I descend from Malinigena, along with many others, Aboriginal people in Tasmania. It's my grandmother and my father. So I'm very honoured to be delivering this lecture today for the wonderful Fay Gale. I've been reading up about her and she is a giant among women. So our topic today is Indigenous data sovereignty, and it's one that's very dear to my heart. And it's one that sort of, it gets me up in the morning with a slightly dented but determined smile on my face. Many of you who are listening won't be familiar or overly familiar with the concept, so we're going to start with some basics in the first half, and then in the second half of the lecture, we're actually going to move to the implementation of data sovereignty, the work that we're doing this year, but also very recently to actually move the concept of Indigenous data sovereignty from a concept through into a reality. And I'll even throw in a little bit of social theory here and there to give the lecture the appropriate academic air. So let's start. There's a lot happening in Indigenous issues at the moment. So we've got the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, which has sort of languished for 10 years, but is now becoming increasingly prominent in documents. We've got the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which once again, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people outlined the sort of relationship that we want to have with the nation state. We've got the work of the Coalition of the Peaks under the wonderful Pat Turner is doing with COAG on the refreshed Closing the Gap new 16 targets. We've got the work we're doing on the Indigenous Voice to Parliament, which that report will be coming out or going to government in November. And we've also got empowered communities, which is sort of a new way of governments and communities doing work together. What all of these things have in common in their newness is they're all reliant on good quality data and the right data for them to actually move from idea to actuality. But before we move into data, let's just do a couple of slides on defining. So I'm going to mostly talk about population data, but Indigenous data is a much broader concept than population data. So to read it out there, it refers to any information or knowledge in any format, inclusive of statistics, that is about Indigenous peoples and that impacts Indigenous lives at the collective or the individual level. So we're talking about resources, environments, plants, history, geological formations like caves, data about us, which is where I'll be mostly focusing today, the demographic and the other data, the social data, and then the data from us, which we're increasingly moving within the Indigenous data sovereignty movement to actually incorporate and encompass our traditional knowledges, all of those things that actually are Indigenous by nature, which now in this data-driven world are becoming more and more commodified. So let's start with our basic definition of Indigenous data sovereignty. So Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of Indigenous peoples to govern the collection, management, access, interpretation, dissemination, and reuse of data related to them. Oops, there we go, there we go. Oh, no, this. So it's about data, relates to all of us. So that, again, that definition of data. It reflects and reaffirms our obligations as Indigenous people to data, to respect data, and to recognise that data belongs to the collective. It's premised on data accountability by those who use the data to Indigenous peoples as per UNDRIP. And it demands that data reflect Indigenous people's priorities and be used to enhance Indigenous collective wellbeing. So that's the definition of Indigenous data sovereignty that we're using at the moment. So I just want to remind people, if you see the term, that is what it means. And we're very mindful when we started here that often Indigenous terms become buzzwords. And we want to make sure that if you're going to use Indigenous data sovereignty or use the term, that that's what you're actually doing and you know what you're doing. If it's not, call it something else. So the data we need and the data we've got are miles and miles apart. They can't see each other. So let's have a look at what some of the problems of the data we've got. And I've aligned these along 5 axes, which just happen to spell out the acronym B.A.D.R data. And as part of the Indigenous data paradox, because what we've got huge amounts of data about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but it's not data that's useful to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. In fact, it's data that often does harm. But the first set of data is data that is blameworthy. It sort of infers complicity in disadvantage. So this little chart actually is about alcohol and drug usage. And you can see Indigenous people in this chart far more likely to use alcohol and drugs than non-Indigenous people. So the question is not whether the data are correct or not correct. It's about how somebody putting this report together thought that this was the most important thing to highlight about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Next, it's aggregate at the state or national level. So this is what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander looks like. We have First Nations, and yet all the data we get, that one in the previous slide, was just national. So if you are in Cape York, how useful is that chart to you? It's not. If you're down in Palawa and Lutruwita here, how useful is that information? It's not. It's more telling a story about Aboriginal people than actually providing data that can actually be used. And it's decontextualised. So this is about smoking. Again, it's national by age group. So the data is always presented simplistically, often just in frequencies or bivariate analysis like these, always comparative, Indigenous against the non-Indigenous people. And we always, which comes to the next one, it's always 5D deficit data. So this is prison incarceration rates in the chart. So it's always highlighting our disparity, our difference, our disadvantage, our dysfunction, our deficit. So this is the focus. So it's not about saying these data are incorrect. It's about saying, why do we only look at this? And finally, it's reductive. So it's always what I call the orthodoxy of the dichotomy. It's always Indigenous compared to non-Indigenous. So it's sort of almost, and we always come out looking, we're always on the wrong side of the equation. So it's always sort of what is wrong with Aboriginal people. And this is a pattern that is global, and it is also as old as colonisation. So if you look at these two data sources, I dare you to spot the difference. So this Colony of Victoria 1858 Select Committee inquiry into the condition of the Aborigines of the colony and the Productivities Commission Overcoming Indigenous Disadvantage report, except for a change of language, they are the same. The data collection and what's of interest is the same, and the approach is the same, and even more damagingly, the outcomes are the same. So we've been doing this for more than 150 years now. It's no surprise, is it, that the closing the gap after 10 years has again failed, and we're now doing a new one. So here's our bit of theory. So I'd like to talk about Scott's work, Seeing Like a State. It's 20 plus years old now, but it's still really important, I think, when you're looking at the data debate. So Scott says that there are 4 elements that you need if you want to create a social policy disaster of truly epic proportions. And there are his 4 elements there, obviously cut right down to fit onto a PowerPoint slide. Now, when he's in his discussion, Scott doesn't actually refer to Indigenous peoples except in his element 3, where he talks about the authoritarian state and the ability to use coercive power. But number 1 and number 2 fit right into our argument and our discussion about data. So Scott says, and I'll just get my little bit here because you can read it much better. So these B.A.D.R data that we just looked at, they're the nation state's preferred mode of the administrative ordering of its Indigenous subpopulations. And they're powerful. So how the state sees its Indigenous populations is the data lens by which Indigenous peoples are made visible. It defines who and what Indigenous peoples are and who and what we are not. It delineates what can be seen and, more critically, what the state refuses to see. So the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Survey is a prime example. It is absolutely chock full of B.A.D.R data as the slice of Indigenous life that the state is interested in. Now, the ABS are working to make it better, and I believe that they are truly committed to this. The trouble is we don't need tinkering around the edges. We need a wholesale paradigm change. And talk of doing data differently creates much institutional nervousness. So Scott's second high modernist ideology, which is a little bit unmodern sort of title now, sort of fits within this current push and rush for an unbridled enthusiasm among governments and the Australian government as well for open data and big data. The idea is that if you open data up and if you allow the connecting of large administrative data sets, then you will get new solutions to embedded social problems. But my argument is if all you have got is just a bigger and bigger ball of 5D data, of B.A.D.R data, then the only outcome, the only result you can get, regardless of how complex your analysis might be, is that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person or family or community is the problem. And we've already seen, we've been doing it for 150 years. It hasn't worked. We need a different way of approaching things. Okay, so let's have a little bit more look at big and open data. It doesn't mean better data. So when we're having a look at this is some of the risks we've outlined. So we are already, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are already heavily overrepresented in the data of disadvantage. So it's just likely to reinforce that key message that the Indigeneity is the problem. We're already alienated from our own data. So big data with the very complex skills that you need further alienates us. Big data is now moving into predictive algorithms and social programs. And we know from what's come out of New Zealand, when it's been applied there, that you don't even need to include a Maori indicator for Maori families to be heavily overrepresented among those who are targeted. So it embeds stigma. And because our populations are so marginalised, our capacity to actually share some of the benefits of big and open data is reduced. And many of you, of course, will be familiar with the FAIR label up there, the findable, accessible, reusable, interoperable. That does not refer to Indigenous peoples at all. You know, we are using it straight as it's come out of the UK. And in Australia, with our push, there has been almost no consideration of Indigenous data. So, for example, the Productivity Commission 2016 Data Availability and Use Report, the government's response to that paper in 2018, the Data Sharing and Release Legislation Issue Paper for Consultation, the Best Practice Guide, the Practice on 5 Safes. None of them make any reference to the term Indigenous or Aboriginal is not in any of them, in any shape or form. Now, as a bit of a plus, just today, the Data Availability and Transparency Bill 2020 exposure draft came across my desk. That does have a short section on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data, because we've made a large number of submissions to the Data Commissioner's Office, which is good news. But the accompanying document, the accreditation framework, again, is an absolutely Indigenous free zone. So it doesn't give me a lot of confidence, even though I can see the willingness there to actually engage this, that as soon as we stop pushing, Indigenous data will get forgotten. And that's a tragedy for everybody. So, moving away from what the problem is, let's have a think about what it would look like if. So what would Indigenous data look like if we were the instigators, analysers and intended audience? What if it was us that was deciding what was collected and what was analysed, and this was based around our needs, priorities and aspirations? And what if those data were framed around what Indigenous people define as important to be known about ourselves? I think you're not going to get B.A.D.R data. It's going to look very, very different. So just as a quick reminder to make sure we're all still on the same page, here's our Indigenous Data Sovereignty definition. Okay. So the mechanism for implementing Indigenous data sovereignty is Indigenous data governance. And this is the other side of the Indigenous data paradox, the data that we haven't got, that we need. So we need data that reflects Indigenous life worlds. We need data that's at the level of First Nations and communities. We need data that's based on Indigenous defined priorities and needs. We need data that contributes directly to our nation rebuilding efforts, and data that are accountable and controlled by the data for the communities or people that they relate to. So next, we're moving into the second half now. So just a little timeline. So Indigenous data sovereignty is a new term, but it's a new term for an old and a long-held concern. So we know from the work of Megan Davis that Indigenous peoples have been asking for better data and have raised concerns about the data that's, because these data we see in Australia, they're replicated right across the Anglo-colonised world. So Maori data, Native American data, all the same. So United Nations Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples has recorded frequent complaints about data. In 1998 is the first known action where First Nations Indigenous Governance Centre supported saying no to the Canadian government, who wanted to come in onto reservations to do yet more health research. And they instituted the OCAP principles: ownership, control, access and possession. Now you'll notice that little registered trademark sign up next to OCAP. Again, they had to do that because they found that people were using the term OCAP all over the place when it wasn't OCAP. So they actually had to register it so it couldn't be used. And then in December 2014, we'd had nothing much in Australia. I got a letter from fellow Academy member, John Taylor, from Maggie from CAPA, and from Tahu Kukatai from University of Waikato, inviting me to the Data Sovereignty for Indigenous Peoples Current Practice and Future Needs workshop. And I'm very proud to say that the Academy actually provided some funding for that workshop. And also the report on the workshop appeared, I think, in 2017 in one of the Academy publications. So that book you see on the side there, Indigenous Data Sovereignty, that's the book that came out of that workshop. It's available free for free download from ANU Press, and I understand it's been downloaded more than 20,000 times. So, next couple of years, the people that were at that workshop, including myself and others, we went away and we formed national Indigenous Data Sovereignty networks. And in 2009, we formed the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. So this is a little bit what it looks like now. So we've got the Tamana Oranga Maori Data Sovereignty Network, we've got the United States Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, and the Maiam Nayri Wingara Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective in Australia. So these are all highly active. We've all got websites that prove we're highly active. And there's emerging First Nations, Inuit, Métis, Sami, and also Mexican Indigenous Data Sovereignty networks getting together. We've also got B.A.D.R, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, a network of networks, and the RDA, International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group. So these are the sort of mechanisms that allow us to do our work. And I might say that until very recently, we have had absolutely no funding for this. This is all done off the side of our desks because we're so committed. Okay, let's have a look at data governance. So it was Diane Smith from ANU who came up with the term governance of data, data of governance. And it's important to see that governance goes both ways. So we want governance, or we need governance of data, and we have the right for the governance of data so that we can refute that 5D data of disregard we looked at earlier. We need that governance so that we can use existing data to tell our own stories about how we're known, and we need to be able to apply Indigenous data protocols to the existing data sets to make sure that they're used appropriately. On the other side, we need data for governance. So we need data to inform our own program and policy delivery at the community and also at the First Nation level. We need to develop our own data infrastructure so communities can collect the right data and keep the right data, keep custodianship. And we need to be designing and deploying our own indicators and measures that aren't just focused on those 5D types of things. So this slide really just sort of outlines major roles of an Indigenous Data Sovereignty network. So people in the network, on the collective in Australia, are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander scholars. We've started the work, but we also need people in our community sector, and we also need people in our institutions, such as IATSIS and the the peaks, coalition of the peaks, to actually work with us on this. So the key task that we're undertaking at the moment is we're out there supporting Indigenous data governance and capability and capacity in our communities. We are trying to promulgate Indigenous data governance protocols and processes. We're advocating for governance practices within the public and the private sector, and we're working at the national and the international level to keep things moving globally. So one of the things that we've done in Australia is that in 2018, the Maiam Nayri Wingara and the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute co-hosted a summit. So we had 50 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders come from around Australia to that. And these are the core protocols that were agreed by that group for Indigenous data in Australia. So we want to exercise the right. We have the right to exercise control of the data ecosystem. We have the right for data that is contextual and disaggregated. We have the right to data that is relevant and empowers our communities. We have the right to data stewardship and structures that are accountable to Indigenous peoples and First Nations. And we have the right to data that is protective and respects our individual and collective interests. So if you want to go on, have a look at the Maiam, nayri, Wingara website, please go on and have a look. That's up the communique from the summit is there, along with a whole lot of other materials. We've been quite successful, I think, within Australia, with Indigenous data sovereignty and nationally, internationally. So this is an excerpt from the report of the Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy to the UN in 2018. And as you can see, Indigenous data sovereignty is in there. Indigenous data sovereignty is actually mentioned in that report I talked to this morning about data availability and transparency in 2020. The risk we face is the enthusiasm for the term running ahead of the understanding, which is one of the key reasons, but the message I'm trying to get through at this particular presentation and others, by myself and others around the place. So we need to make sure that people, yes, are signing on, but they also need to really understand what it is that we're asking or requesting. But let's have a look at the FAIR and CARE. So this is some of the work now that we've been doing most recently. So as you know, FAIR is out there, it's coming to all our data sets. So at the 2018 meeting in Botswana for the RDA, the Global Indigenous Data Governance for Data Indigenous Sovereignty Group got together, and especially with the work of Maui Hudson and Stephanie Russo-Carroll, developed the CARE principles. So the point with CARE is not to replace FAIR, is to say that if you are working in the Indigenous space, yes, apply FAIR, but you also apply CARE. They've met their companion to work together. It's worth having a little bit of a look at each of these. So we've got collective benefit. So this is about, the data we need, it's about the data ecosystems again. And it must actually contribute to improved governance, equitable outcomes, and be inclusive. Authority to control, the big one. It has to recognise Indigenous rights and interests. It has to fit those two, data for governance, governance of data criteria. It has to enable both of those. Responsibility, it's about being responsible to those who are the subject of data or the objects of data. So people, you've collected data, then there is a responsibility back to those people. Again, you can find the CARE principles on I'll give you the websites at the end, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance website, and the CARE principles also found themselves in this document that I just spoke about before. And it's about ethics. It's about rights and well-being. So I know we already fill in the thing about minimising harm and maximising benefits, but some of the things I review, the benefit is most definitely not evenly shared. So the last couple of slides are about some work that are happening right at the moment about traditional knowledge labels and biocultural labels and notices. And I'm using these courtesy of Professor Jane Anderson from NYU and Professor Maui Hudson from the University of Waikato. So myself and Jane, Maui and Stephanie Russo-Carroll are involved in this Enrich project. We get receiving funding for this from Minderoo, and I am actually the global chair along with Jane Anderson for Enrich for 2020. I have to tell you that being a global chair in 2020 is a bit of a fizzer, but we do what we can. So let's have a look at traditional knowledge labels. They're fascinating. So one of the things that became really obvious early on when we were looking at how we needed to apply Indigenous data governance was to think that there needs to be some way to tag data and data sets so that people who are using them now can recognise what they need to do, the various bits and pieces that are associated with them, that tagging can travel with the data set and that it's available for all future users. So these data labels, and you can see here there's 16 of them at the moment, they're sort of meta categories around protocols. So there are a protocol category in each one. We'll see them more closely in the next slide. So what they were originally developed by Jane Anderson to tag items in museums and cultural collections, but they can be applied to other types of data. So these communities who own the data, and that's not the people who currently possess it, that's the Indigenous community for whom the resource belongs, can customise those labels to actually put in all the information that they need about who it belongs to, where it came from, what are the right protocols for use, and anything else that anybody who comes across it or wants to use it needs to know to have a cultural licence to be able to use that. Now, institutions can also apply, they can apply notices. So if you've got some data where the Indigenous owners of that data are not able to or not currently ready to apply a label, you can still tag it with a notice. Researchers can do the same thing. And we're also now, or this is especially the work of Mary Hudson, developing items around biocultural labels because of the big uptick that we've seen around genomic data, data around traditional plants, medicines, etc. So let's have a slightly closer look at the TK labels. So here they are, all in all their glory. So they're the same set. They're being used all over the place now. I think they've been around for about 5 years. Localcontext.org there is where you find more information about them. Now, to be used, you need permission from local context to use them. There's no fee. It's a completely philanthropic exercise, but it's to make sure they're not mixed use. So I know that there has recently had to be sent a cease and desist letter to one company in Australia who was using these data traditional knowledge labels against some of their food products without permission and completely inappropriately. So they're machine readable. So it's really important. They're machine readable and they actually allow that cultural protocol for sharing knowledge. That's their key purpose. So this is an example. So this is a Passamaquoddy war song. So this is from the Library of Congress, and you can see all the normal information you would expect from an entry on the Library of Congress. But over the edge there, you can also see that there's traditional knowledge labels for attribution, who it belongs to and how it is to be attributed, about the education and outreach, so what is it meant to be used for and how they want it to be used, and they're not to be commercialised. So it cannot be used for a money-making purpose. So I know this is a very rapid-fire introduction to TK labels, but you can go onto the Local Context website and learn much more. Similarly, the biocultural labels, so there's 6 of those at the moment, and these are still in development, but they're coming along very strongly. So those 6 are around provenance, whether consent has been verified, whether it can be used, whether the Indigenous peoples for whom that biocultural data belong to are open to collaboration, whether it can be commercialised or not, whether there are multiple communities involved, and whether it's available for research use. So again, those same things happen. If you're working in the genomic area or working on plants and foods, you can apply those notices to say that you are waiting for the Indigenous owners or the Indigenous people around that data to actually come in and contact them to actually do a BC label. Some of the other work we're doing most recently is we're working for the Institutes of, Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers Standards Association. Now I know that sounds the IEEE, that sounds like a very strange place for Indigenous data to be going, but it isn't, because what they do, the IEEE Standards Association, apply global standards. So we've got a working group that we're actually looking to defining, because what we're trying to do there is about provenance of Indigenous data. So we're working there now to actually set those up. And so hopefully they'll be coming to some Indigenous data near you very soon. So Walika, that's all for me. That finishes my presentation after a slightly, well, a quite wobbly start. So there's the Indigenous Data Sovereignty book that I recommend for everybody. There's the Maiam nayri Wingara website. There's the B.A.D.R website. And this book is coming out in November. So that's an edited collection by myself, Stephanie Tahu and Desi Rodriguez-Lonebear from a different, and that's got 14 chapters from people all around the globe. We have actually purchased the open access rights to that book, so that should also be freely available. So I'd just like to finish on the note that yes, please go in, please find out more, contact me if you need to. I'll be very happy to help, and thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you, Maggie. That was an enlightening and fascinating discussion. I learned a lot, certainly. Now, a reminder to everyone, we're going to be taking questions via the chat function. So please go ahead and type in your questions, and I'll moderate that kind of question and answer session with Maggie. Just while we're waiting for the questions to come through, do you find it strange that given how far behind in some respects Australia is in terms of reconciliation more generally, are you surprised that we're so far ahead in terms of Indigenous data sovereignty under your leadership and that of others?
Well, it's not just me, of course. We've got a very active group of high-level scholars all working on this. I guess I'm going to put this kindly. Often when we're working with government agencies, we have to say to them, look, what we're hearing from you sounds like it did in 1990. We're not in 1990 anymore. We're in 2020, and we have to keep moving. We can't wait for you to catch up any longer. So this is about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia and Indigenous peoples all over the globe, pushing ahead to say, we can't wait for institutions and government agencies and others to catch up, because we're going to be waiting too long, and the risk is that they will never catch up. So what we have to do is lead, and that's what we're trying to do, and we certainly are making some headway.
Thank you. So a question on the chat from Nikki Moody. What do you think, Maggie, are the research training implications for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander scholars, even at the undergraduate level?
Sorry, Chris, can you repeat that?
What do you think are the research training implications for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander scholars, perhaps even in an undergraduate context?
Thank you, Nikki. Look, there are huge research applications. Look, I've been an academic for nearly 25 years now, so I've seen how the change has taken place. And it's not too long ago where I got in contact with somebody who was doing a big piece of research to say, look, I was interested in being part of it. And I was told, thanks, but no thanks, we've already got one. So that sort of idea that you just have all these non-Indigenous researchers and add one Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander research to give it a little bit of legitimacy, those days are gone. Some researchers haven't caught up with that fact yet, but Indigenous researchers certainly have. So it's about Indigenous leadership. That is the first principle of Indigenous data sovereignty. That doesn't mean we don't work with non-Indigenous people. We do, and we work really well. And we have a fabulous relationship with a lot of really great people. But I think that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics, especially emerging in early career, It's about taking that leadership role and working with other more senior Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander scholars to move us through. And we know also that non-Indigenous researchers often will not cite our work. So we have a real problem is that you can read something and you sort of think, why are all the citations in this piece, which is basically about something Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander related, and yet there's almost no Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics referenced in it, even though we know what people are working in space. So we have to reference each other, and we have to, so if I was newly starting out now, I would be looking around, and I did, but I'll be looking around even more about the sort of people I can work with and who can mentor me and move me through to leadership.
Thank you, Maggie. Another question here. Could you speak about the conflict we seem to keep having about Indigenous data, specifically Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders' contributions and stories versus copyright in universities?
Yes, well, that's at the heart of Indigenous data sovereignty, isn't it? If it's traditional stories and contributions of elders, then it is their data. It is not enough to acknowledge the people. And I've seen this repeatedly in things where stories are taken from people in the community who are encouraged to share them because they are encouraged by the researcher, who always have the best of intentions, that these stories are important and need to get out. But once they're published in somebody else's name, they stop belonging by law to the people whom they do belong. And of course, they can never be taken, but they are. And so they come up then, and that person's name is cited. So if you're working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, they must at the very least be authors, and there must be some governance, and there must be an agreement that those stories do not belong, that having been written up does not take ownership. So I'm not sure about the copyright law. I think it probably needs to be investigated about how researchers can make sure that they don't inadvertently take copyright of materials and resources and data that are not theirs.
Thank you. Another question, Maggie. How does collective well-being and benefit articulate with data about individuals who sit outside collectives? And an example is the Closing the Gap Refresh framework about collectives or individuals, and who will collect the data to ensure collective well-being is properly reflective of Indigenous viewpoints in all their diversity? A long question. Is that...
It's a long question. And look, collective well-being is just a basic principle of how Indigenous peoples be. It's an ontological base for indigeneity. And that applies in Australia, it applies in New Zealand, it applies in the US. So the individual focus of things, such as the previous Closing the Gap targets, is problematic. It doesn't mean you can't have individual well-being. You must, you know, one thing doesn't trump the other. But I think this partnership now with the Coalition of the Peaks will work, and they'll have the job cut out for them to really ensure that it's about collective well-being as well as individual well-being. Yes, we want to reduce the horrible, horrible rate of young Aboriginal people suiciding. But if you approach that as an individual wellbeing issue, then you're never, ever going to make a difference. They're not committing suicide because of who they are as individuals. The context in which they live their lives in Australia, in their community, and in the wider how they're positioned within Australia, has a big impact. So you must look at collective wellbeing. Everybody has to be better. I mean that better as well being better.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions here, but we're getting close to time, so I'll perhaps just pick two of the questions we've got on our screen at the moment. You called out open data in particular when talking about the B.A.D.R problem with existing data. Sorry, I'm not sure of the acronym. Do you think the open data paradigm, collecting data but making it available to everyone, is inherently problematic in the context of Indigenous data sovereignty, or is it just a problem of implementation?
No, it's a problem. It's a basic problem. The idea that somehow if you let everybody, so at the moment, data is still being, Indigenous data is still being analysed by people who really don't understand the Indigenous context. Making it open data just magnifies that 1,000%. I'll give you an example. I've been into the Queensland Government Open Data Portal of recent times, and there was a data set up there, which they've since taken down since I complained, which was talking about alcohol and drug treatments and that were given. So on this data set, there were the postcode of the people, whether they were Aboriginal, whether they were Torres Strait Islander, whether they were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, what drug treatments they had, and their age range. So you've only got to look at that. And I reckon in 3 phone calls, I could find the Torres Strait Islander woman from a certain postcode who would receive treatment for this problem and that problem. And that's been taken down now. But the fact that I, as an individual, have to go to them and say, we have a problem here, it just shows that the message is not getting through. And so that risk of people, the stigma and the people analysing the data who really have no understanding but just run the data through their programs is just huge. And I just know that we're just going to have more and more and more of it. And I would hope that journals and reviewers of journals are far more discerning in looking at what is happening and who are analysing data and what qualifications they have to actually come to analyse that data and interpret it. I mean, I'm hoping everybody on this call today will never look at those charts and tables in the same way again, that you'll always question them and say, why this data? Why is this the most important thing? What might be better data?
Okay, well, thank you, Maggie. That's been fascinating. We're right on time, so we'll wrap up here. But as I said, we'll be putting this lecture on the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia website in the next few days. So please do share it with any of your colleagues you think might be interested. There's some really important lessons here. And I think, as our speaker has said, as Maggie said, there are fundamental implications for research and the way we do research in the future. So on behalf of our co-hosts, the University of Tasmania and the Fay Gale Centre, I'd like to extend another thank you to Professor Walter for a fascinating talk, and wishing you all the very best with the rest of 2020. Thank you once again.